Voting. We often view it as a fundamental right and the very heart and soul of our democracy. The right to vote allows us to express support for a motion, candidate, or party, and it's the most significant way to have our voice heard. But historically, the right to vote was limited only to men.
Exactly 100 years ago, women were first allowed to vote in California, but the battle for women's voting rights, or women's suffrage as it's often called, was not an easy one. It took more than 70 years.
It all began in 1840, when 2 women were barred from attending an anti-slavery convention in Europe. This prompted them to hold a women's convention in Seneca Falls, New York.
Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton got together and organized this conference, which basically modeled itself. They issued a proclamation kind of modeled on the Declaration of Independence, which was a Declaration of Independence for women. And we rightly mark kind of the beginning of the women's equality movement in the United States from this point.
At the time, women were banned from inheriting property, serving on juries, signing contracts, and voting in elections.
Suffrage leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony dedicated their lives to reform and campaigned vigorously for women's rights.
Suffrage in the middle of the 19th century was not a galvanizing force for organizing women to accomplish some goal. It was diametrically opposed to the predominant kind of ethic of the age, which was this idea of gendered spheres, that men were supposed to have one role in society and women were supposed to have another role.
Many feared women would be corrupted by politics and even argued it wasn't their place.
Women in the 19th century campaigns had to convince male voters that having the vote wouldn't change anything, that women would still be devoted to the home and the family, they would remain pure, they would remain innocent, that having the vote would not corrupt them.
In spite of opposition, reformers gradually built support through state and local campaigns, and California was amongst the trailblazers.
Leaders like Ellen Clark Sargent organized in their homes. They had private meetings that they called parlor meetings. They had afternoon teas. They spoke of these meetings as though they were just social calls and not explicitly political activism. They did everything they could to ground their campaign in femininity and domesticity so that their activism would not be threatening.
Despite their efforts, the link between suffrage and prohibition made it tough to win over voters in the big cities, especially San Francisco.
The problem in San Francisco was that women's suffrage as an idea was associated with temperance. Susan B. Anthony made that connection herself in the 1880s when she abandoned the Republican Party and she joined the Prohibition Party. Prohibition was a deadly idea in San Francisco because liquor was the foundation of the local economy. It was also the center of masculine public life. Anything that touched on the possibility of prohibition was completely unpopular.
The first campaign in California was a great effort, but not a success. In 1896, male voters rejected a ballot that would have approved women's suffrage in the state. But the war was not over. Less than a decade later, a crafty protest brought new life to the movement.
Lillian Harris Coffin and the Woman Equal Suffrage League march on the Republican convention in Oakland, and this time they did something even more unthinkable. They had a suffrage march. They had about 300 women who marched down the streets of Oakland to the convention center carrying a women's suffrage banner. It was still a very public demonstration and a signal that women now considered the public sphere properly female, that they were entitled to be there.
With a new strategy, the reformers joined together for another campaign.
Selena Solomons in 1910 opens a club in downtown San Francisco on Sutter Street near Union Square that she calls the Votes for Women's Club. And she offers lunch every day to the shop girls and the working women. And her idea is that if she can get the shop girls to come in and have lunch, then she can interest them in suffrage literature. And the lunchroom was a tremendous success.
So there had to be a social transformation in the way people thought about women's equality, women's rights, and women's role in society before you could have a successful, truly successful campaign. And what happened with women's clubs is they began to build the base of support for that, that transformation, that social transformation. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible for them outward, and they began to engage in civic and public work.
What followed were parades and rallies, door-to-door canvassing, street speeches, plays and pageants, reaching every voter in the state from San Diego to Sacramento.
The eyes of the nation were on California in 1911 when male voters flocked to the polls and approved women's right to vote by a narrow margin. It was the 6th and largest state in the nation to approve women's suffrage. A decade later, women received full voting rights in the United States after the passing of the 19th Amendment. And to help newly enfranchised women exercise their responsibilities to vote, a new political club was founded.
The League of Women Voters was started in 1920. Really, it was a movement that was created from the momentum of all the suffragettes moving forward with getting the right to vote. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in August of 1920, all of those suffragettes now were interested in educating the new 20 million new voters.
Today, the League has chapters in all 50 states. It is nonpartisan and does not endorse candidates, but it is very much political and works to influence policy through advocacy. 100
years ago, our voice wasn't heard. In fact, they weren't even going to give us the right to vote. That's how insignificant our voice may have been. And I really hope people vote. It's our one way to have our voice heard.
To celebrate California's 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, events and exhibits are taking place throughout the state.
The Bancroft Library in UC Berkeley is having an exhibit which highlights the women's suffrage movement. It chronicles the women's struggle in California towards finally winning the right to vote.
So how long has this exhibit been going on?
It was installed the week of August 20th. A lot of people don't realize that California actually allowed women to vote almost a decade before the nation did in the 1920s. All these materials were pulled from the Bancroft Library collections. We have a huge amount of manuscript and ephemeral material regarding this time period. This exhibit is going to be open until the end of December and possibly longer if there's enough interest in it.
We're at the 37th annual Solana Stroll Parade, where a group depicting and honoring the 1911 suffragists will march today in commemoration of 100 years of voting in California.
100 years ago this year, we won the right to vote. This would have been worn around that time, around 1911, and here we are, dressed as they would have dressed.
Register and vote. We want the right to vote. Register and vote. We want the right to vote.
So whether you're marching for a cause or voting in the next election, make your voice heard and vote. I'm Nona Melkonian. Thanks for watching.